Welcome to TradeTheMBI.com. This is John's reports for the 26th. Well, nothing new under the sun. As we can see, the continuation is straight up with everything. MBI reading, as well as a little bit of this softening of the steel, suggesting a little bit of softening from short-term buyers, which kind of led to a soft day, as well as we've had midterm buyers kind of weak, not surprising towards end of the month, but shakeout very close to moving to positive territory, which would be bullish towards new highs. Seeing a small increase in our MBI white readings here, but again, until you have magenta moving back below yellow, this is still on track for continuation. Almost identical readings from the NASDAQ, except for you can see the big differences in white being above magenta. This hanging over its head, as soon as magenta comes down, I think you're going to see a lot more weakness out of the NASDAQ than you would out of the S&P on any weakening. And that just becomes relevant because it puts a drag on the remainder of the S&P as well. So it's just worth noting as we see it, and that's the only discrepancy that we have between the two, though it is positive shakeout already on the NASDAQ because it was coming from a much deeper oversold level. But again, pretty straightforward. You've got the 76% above and the 61 down below. We're at the top side of that range, so as it reaches that 76, if you can't get above, that becomes sort of like your ceiling threshold, and I think it will continue to face difficulty unless it gets past that. And then above there is the yellow EBM up at the 13.8 range. Becomes pretty straightforward. Gold, yeah, it's just going to continue its non-stop ascent, as well as euro, as much as it's driving Eurozone crazy. With the increase, with the positioning of where the U.S. and the Fed is, it's not going to change anytime soon. From an intraday standpoint, we started off, ended up with a few positive extremes in the pre-market. Those then just filled right back in as we started to see the white over the magenta, and that's where it began. And then it was just a matter of waiting for beginning of a turn down here in the MBI blue. And at that particular point, you can pick any one of these. That's why you get these little moving across signals just as it's waiting. Then you get the full DOC spread. But at that point, you had yellow moving above magenta, as magenta was basically just going sideways on the MBI reading. But that led to that breakdown that came through. And once that breakdown happened, we ended up with the green signal, which is the magenta over yellow and MBI blue over there. And while these can produce upside ranges when they're below that 50% range, they tend not to be more than, like I was saying, typically between 5 and 13 point range bumps. But oftentimes if that blue, like in this particular case, starts pivoting below the 25, it doesn't produce anything but new lows. And so it's worth noting. Now in this case, it was fairly decent. You had the steel rising above cyan and the orange dipping below. It just, within that soft category, having this much of a time span of the white above that 10 tends to produce kind of softer results. Usually you tend to get a stronger move of the magenta and that above it quickly. Your blue doesn't have to get above the 10, but typically I like to see it make a strong transition above in order to justify decent long strength. Even in this case, it's still not impossible to get out of it a relatively break-even configuration. After several bars, it still went sideways, but wasn't able to build any momentum because the white stayed above throughout most of this. And then we have this secondary one, similar kind of situation where you have this long period of white above, and then boom, you get the crossover, tries to make a move, but literally right here when it pops above the magenta. Now in these particular cases when magenta has peaked higher, you tend to have the possibility that it can sustain itself, but without a orange dip coming back below red, it just doesn't have any strength. And that's exactly what was expressed the rest of the time. And then we had this, again, similar run. If we slide over, orange candle came in, still decent because at this point the magenta was over and staying above the 33 level, and pretty strongly so, not until it started its decay, which happened right about here. But at that point you had really negative white under 10, and in that case you really want to see it either move above the red, which is right where the little magenta candle pops in. And even when it did, started to turn around, but this one becomes clear when you get this pivot, and you've already got a down pivot of magenta and it's below the 33. That tends to express a bit more weakness, and of course it gives you a couple of bars until that crossover right there, and that led to the eventual dip. And the expectation is that we're going to get down to the zero. I usually look for some range right between the 0% and the 23 as a cover point, and that's exactly what it did. It then tried to make a little bit of a pop, but we could tell that wasn't going to happen. Literally the bar after, so the white candle comes and then boom, immediately right after on the down pivot, and at that particular point you know that it's probably going to make new lows, and in which case it did. And it continued to repeat that process until we got down to these magenta candles right here. And early on, and this is one that I look for, where that magenta crosses over pretty quick. The blue not quite having responded, but see, again, it gives you a couple of bars right through there for when the blue crosses above, and you've already got a strong move going of magenta above. And then the white does pop above, but you still have the continued magenta rising. And once it rises, you still have to wait for that to finish. And kind of did so right over here. I'm not likely to jump on the ones that are below 7.5 range to 8. So in all of these, even though it's been back and forth, it really haven't had enough of a push of white, even with the DOC spread, and that's why those tend to react that way. So when you have the white riding a bit more above 10, you're going to typically get a bit more of that breakdown, because often what will happen here is you get just the brief dip, and then it kind of just gives you muck trading in between. Still quite a few positive extremes on this setup, so I would expect that we're still going to fill back all the way down to that 4187 under the proper configurations. As always, though, I will elaborate more of these on the Skype chat, and we can detail them all. But overall, don't fight the Fed. Plain and simple. As always, though, trade well, and we'll talk on the Skype chat.